The first speaker for today's session is Dr. Leena Chandra Observer Research Foundation, Mumbai, and member of Drafting Committee National Education Policy 2020. She will be presenting on topic NEP 2020 for higher education, ground realities, challenges, and effectiveness of strategic implementation. I cordially invite Dr. Leena ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm going to share my presentation. I hope you can see it. So thank you for this opportunity. And I should probably have put in the name of the School of Visual Media and Communications. Thank you all for giving me the opportunity to speak. So what I will do is that because Dr. Shakila is going to be providing an NEP overview of the NEP in the afternoon, what I will do is I will look ahead and set the stage for her to do so. And towards that, I will share with you the thinking of the committee members and many of the people we consulted and so on. And the title given to me was Ground Realities, Challenges and Effectiveness of Strategic Implementation. So that's how I'm going to partition what I want to say. I will talk about where we stand now as a country, which is not new. Most people know, you know it too, so I won't spend too much time on it. I will also talk about how NEP can be implemented successfully, how we think NEP can be implemented successfully. And I will talk a bit about what should higher education institutions and faculty members be doing, and how can the interventions we make be made more effective. And separating out from these three topics, I will talk a bit about, what are the challenges facing our future generations and how best can we prepare them for it. Okay, so as there are some ground realities in higher education today. Everybody knows it. We'll just go through it just quickly, just to set the context. So from the perspective of undergraduate students, there is a severe shortage of good quality higher education. You might say that the GER is 26%, that is as of 2018. It's not high, but it's not low either. But even then, I would say that the opportunities for good quality education is less than 10%. That is 1 in 10 children get a good quality higher education. So this is causing a severe impact on the childhoods of children, because they are being forced into tuition and all kinds of trauma for trying to get into the few institutions. We have too much examination focus. Students are taught mostly in lecture mode. There's very little undergraduate research, and of course almost no training in writing. And this is really something that we must talk about much more. People finish their entire studies in English medium through school and through college, and they reach PhD level, and they even finish their PhD. And I was recently at a gathering of industry people, and they said that what we find lacking the most among PhD scholars is that they don't want to write, and they're not able to write, because we don't give enough writing practice. Writing is powerful. Writing is the best way to convince people. So this is something that we have to do. Similarly, students are not motivated to be in class largely. This is not, I'm sure Amrita and all are exceptions, but exceptions only go to prove the rule. And of course, if we didn't have mandatory minimum attendance, probably people wouldn't have attended. We are day colleges, you see. We are not residential, so there's not enough opportunities for students to learn from each other. The strength of JNU and various IITs and so on is the fact that students learn a lot from each other. There's not enough opportunities for learning by doing. There's not enough apprenticeships and internships being arranged for students. That is a lot of effort on the part of higher educational institutions, but I think we need to make them. And we discussed already this morning about Community Connect, and I think Mata Amrita Mai has been very correctly identified that, some of our role is also to alleviate the lives of people less fortunate than us. And there are too many single disciplinary institutions, we know that 65% of colleges have less than 500 students. Most of higher education is private, so the responsibility for quality education is private. So basically, what is all this telling us? What it is telling us is that higher education today has lost sight of its primary purpose, which is preparing students for life and for citizenships. And, these numbers from the India Skills Report 2020 of employability data just shows us that there are 30s and 40s are dominant in terms of percentages of employability. This is not even employment, which basically means that 1 in 2 or 1 in 3 students are getting a decent education, and the other 2 are wasting their education. Are wasting their time getting an education that is not worth, that the time that they are spending on it, which is shocking, isn't it? And of course, the other major ground realities at the macro level is the fact that regulators are failing. There's too much regulation is interpreted as micromanagement. There are too many weak, poor quality higher education institutions, too many regulators. Professor Raghuraman talked about that, a university is stuck with interacting with all professional bodies, which are actually professional association of practitioners. They can regulate the professional practice, but they should not be regulating higher education institutions. And the NEP has tried to change that. And similarly, education is supposed to be a non-profit activity, but in many, many cases, it is not. We know that there are legal ways to take money out, and people are doing that. And of course, the teaching profession has become largely unattractive. I was shocked to read a few months ago that 69% of teachers in Karnataka are on contract, actually, and that's and paid relatively low wages. So and this is possible because we have a centralized exit examination, which means that the moment you take away from the teacher the right to examine their students and to examine and certify their students, you sideline them and you undervalue them. And so this is what also we are trying to change in the NEP. And of course, universities are increasingly not safe spaces anymore. If you look in our history and you look at all the reports that came, Madhav Menon Committee or Yashpal Committee reports, all of them talk about the fact that it's not important whether it is irrespective of whether institutions have autonomy or not. Teachers must always have autonomy in their classes, but that's sadly not true anymore. They are not, and we have this famous situation of a professor in Goa whose colleagues are taking turns to guard her because she said something in class that offended somebody. This is not okay. Universities have to be safe spaces for discussion, and that too needs to change. So, like I said in my inaugural address this morning, we need leadership at all levels, and the people who can save us are motivated faculty members. So, so the approach to NEP, and you will hear from Shakila on this, is to be flexible yet integrated. There is considerable, this is my single slide on the NEP. I don't want to, Shakila will explain it much more beautifully. There is considerable regulatory reform with reliance on accreditation outcomes, to decide everything. And the regulation is based on the principle of separation of powers with minimal regulation. Autonomy to higher education institutions is center stage, and it will be based on accreditation outcomes. It will focus on empowering teachers, phasing out the affiliation system, which creates a dependency system, and on consolidation of higher education institutions. We want more institutions like Amrita, which have 20,000 students plus, and a lot less than 500 and 100 enrollment, which we have in our country today. So we want 40, 50,000 institutions to become much fewer in number, but with a larger enrollment, giving more scope for peer learning for students. Similarly, we already talked about broad-based multidisciplinary education, 3-year, 4-year undergraduates, all of them to stay, because the policy is flexible, because the requirements are different in different parts of the country, and for different people. So, we have not tried to force anything on anybody. Similarly, promotion of research and new knowledge creation is important, and the National Research Foundation idea has come out, and it has been very, very attractive to the government, and we should see it rolling out in a few months, which is great, because the institutions will get not only funding, but they will also get mentorship from experienced researchers. And of course, equity. Like Mata Amritamani said, equity and inclusion has to be very, very critical. And the policy has many elements for equity and inclusion. There are not just 2 chapters, but there's talk of special education zones, there's talk of multidisciplinary education and research universities, gender inclusion fund, and much more. And of course, innovative uses of technology. And I mentioned this already, the Academic Bank of Credit. So I'll move on. I don't want to stay with the NEP for too much. I just had this old slide, so I kept it here because I just wanted to mention that, when we had to come up with the policy, there were some instructions given to us, which is basically 2 of them, which is to say that NEP needs to be aligned with India's overall development goals of becoming a knowledge economy and developing sustainably and equitably, and also that it should be a policy with a long-term horizon. So what we've done is taken a few decisions, which was the framework within which we tried to develop the policy, which is to keep the focus squarely on faculty members, improve their conditions of work because we'd like them to take the lead in transforming education. Similarly, empower managements of higher education institutions, including private institutions, and nurture research capacity, focus on strengthening government institutions, and pay adequate attention to internationalization, because diversity in a classroom and in the world, we need to teach our students to be world citizens. They need to understand each other, understand the ways of thinking and constraints and so on. And of course, a new regulatory framework that eliminated the conflicts of interest of the existing framework, and a powerful mechanism to try to make sure that the implementation of the policy is successful. What that means is that, policy implementation, we start and go in one direction. We never complete the feedback loop. We need to complete the feedback loop. We need to gather data on how the policy implementation is proceeding, and tweak policy implementation as necessary. And for that, we had suggested the National Education Commission. That hasn't come through, but apparently CABE is going to be enhanced to do this job. So let's hope that that will happen actually. So what are the challenges in implementing the NEP? Like I said this morning, Dr. Kasturirangan says it again and again and again, that he's quite worried that, given a transformational policy targeting overhaul of the system, where the destination is clearly articulated in the policy, but the pathways are not, we need dozens of educators and educationists to imbibe the spirit of the policy, have a change in mindset, drop a control mindset, and provide thoughtful leadership to lead the transformation and create pathways for their own institutions. And if they succeed, then those can become best practices for other institutions. For example, we have said that affiliations will be phased out in 15 years. Why? Because we want early institutions to create best practices, which then provide inspiration for other weaker institutions to follow in their footsteps. So what is the compass for the implementation of the NEP? It's good that we have a compass, and the compass is simply this: what is good for our students? What will give them 21st century skills they need to deal with the 21st century? And what will teach them to learn how to learn and to become lifelong learners? I think we are at the beginning of this phase where we all realize that all of us need to become lifelong learners. For example, when the technology when the pandemic happened, we were all forced into emergency response mode of online teaching, in which anything was okay. But online learning is a huge area of research, and a lot is known about how to hold the students' interest, how to design courses, and so on and so on. So over time, all faculty members will slowly have to learn about online learning and become better at holding the attention of their students in the online mode actually. So a lot is expected from faculty members, and so they need to be supported by their managements to collaborate, cooperate, and so on, I talked earlier about wanting to give students 21st century skills and becoming lifelong learners, and I want to talk about this diagram, which I have taken from a World Economic Forum report that came in 2016. It was called the New Vision of Education, and it talked about the fact that students need some 16 skills for the 21st century. And if you look at the center, the yellow block, it talks about the core competencies that students need to approach complex challenges, and that includes critical thinking and problem solving. It includes creativity, it includes communication skills, and communication skills meaning serious communication skills, including writing and collaboration and so on. And also it includes, it requires, so competencies, they are defining as how students approach complex challenges. And then character qualities as how students approach the changing environment, which is listed in blue. You need to strengthen their curiosity, their initiative. You cannot suppress their initiative. You have to encourage it. You have to help them develop persistence and grit and rise from failures. They have to be adaptable. They have to develop leadership roles, and they have to be aware of of their society and of cultural issues. And of course, on the pink block is all the core knowledge that they need. How students apply core skills to everyday tasks, which includes literacy, numeracy, scientific literacy, ICT literacy, financial literacy. So many people, young people, get undergraduate degrees, postgraduate degrees, and they don't have financial literacy, and they don't know how to save for their future, actually, for example. And then also cultural and civic literacy. So this whole what everybody talks about 21st century skills goes by many names. The people call it life skills, they call it soft skills, they call it non-cognitive skills. Sometimes people talk about 4 C's or 5 C's. What they mean by the C's are this critical thinking, creativity, communication, collaboration, and curiosity is often used. And the 3 R's are referred to as reading, writing, arithmetic. But we must remember that competencies and skills are different things. Competencies are more than skills. Competencies are usually for a job. If you are competent for doing a certain job, what that means is that you have the knowledge and the skills and the attitudes required for that job. So knowledge is what you know, skills is what can you do, and attitudes are what you believe in. So these are the guidelines for taking this. So I came across this in 2016, and many of you may have come across other definitions. So here is another definition where UNICEF has recently come out with in 2019 with a comprehensive life skills framework for India, where they claim that there's a document on the internet. They claim that they have actually discussed with Indian decision makers and decided that these are the 10 skills. So, if you look at the previous slide, I'm sorry. If you look at the previous slide, the number of skills in this 6 4, and then this 6 includes some 10 skills which form the social and emotional learning. Here they have come up with a slightly different specification of 10 skills, where they talk about empathy, and they talk about resilience, they talk about negotiation and decision making and self-awareness. And these are categorized under 4 categories of empowerment of young people, of preparing them to be employable, of helping them to be lifelong learners, and of helping them to be good citizens, actually. And these are mapped to these 4 pillars of education that came out in this famous 1996 UNESCO report, which came out at the turn of the century, which talked about learning the treasure within. Actually, that's the first time 21st century skills were talked about, and that's a beautiful document to read also. So there are many methods of talking about 21st century skills. Can you teach them? And the answer is a resounding yes. There are 2 World Economic Forum reports which talks about how you can teach them and how you can use technology, interactive games, and so on to also teach them. So, for example, when we gave this diagram, and this is also from the World Economic Forum report, to the Karnataka government, they were very happy, because now at least there is a prescription by which teachers can look at it and think about how to teach. But you'll see that means that you have to change the classroom practices, because you see, if you want children to develop critical thinking and problem solving, you need to discuss with them and you need to give them constructive feedback. Similarly, if you want to them to develop creativity, you need to give them opportunities to build and innovate, and you need to provide them the autonomy to make their own choices. And that's where the creativity will build. And similarly, you need, for communication, you need to create a language rich environment. And for collaboration, you need to foster greater respect for and tolerance for others, and provide opportunities for group work, so team-based projects and so on and so on. But yes, and nowadays, of course, even at the business schools are teaching courses. They always teach on leadership and negotiation and decision making, but they're also teaching courses on critical thinking and problem solving and so on. So I recently did a report for UNESCO on vocational education, and the reference is there in one of my last slides. And also, the NEP also puts enormous emphasis on integration of vocational education into schools and colleges, because skills are best developed through learning by doing. And learning by doing is a critical part of learning, because we are assuming in our classrooms that people only have verbal and mathematic and intellectual skills, but there are many people who are very good with their hands, calisthenic skills, and so on. So there are many different skills that people have. And so if you integrate vocational education into schools and colleges, then students will get the chance to, all students will get the chance to learn by doing, and that will help them make better decisions for their long-term futures. So the policy, of course, technology is a big part in all this. So the policy has very carefully recommended the creation of a National Education Technology Forum, which will be an advisory body to help educational institutions navigate through the explosion of edtech products. I recently heard the talk where somebody said that the edtech market is worth some 2 trillion or something. But if you have zillions of companies, then how does an educational institution decide what it is good to use and what is not, actually? So these are all real challenges. And like I said, continuous support is needed for young people for communications and scientific writing. You need to set up online centers, writing centers, and allow students to bring their writing to these writing centers and get feedback on it till as many times as necessary, till they are confident that they are now able to write well, actually. These are important things to do. So writing centers on campus is important. Maybe Amrita already has it. I'm sorry, I'm not aware of it. Similarly, we all talk about wanting design thinking, but Dr. Kasturi Rangan always says that you need a liberal education to help to develop design thinking, because you need an appreciation of nature, you need an appreciation of aesthetics, and so on, and all our rich arts and culture, which was also mentioned this morning, to develop a sense of design thinking. And of course, apprenticeships and internships are absolutely critical. They should be woven into as many courses as possible. And even within educational institutions, it's possible to provide internships and apprenticeships. Students can learn administration. Students can learn management. They can help with the tech because they're natively comfortable. And so they can be given many opportunities within an institution. And for me, the most eye-opening moment in my life was when I met a young undergraduate student in the US, who had been part of, he was an undergraduate student, okay, third year of his 4-year undergraduate program, and he was part of an 8-member committee to choose the next president of their college. And I couldn't believe it. And I made him sit for half an hour and tell me, what did you do? How did you do it? And he explained so clearly, to think of including a student in a selection committee for the president of the college. that's the level of opportunity that they give students to develop leadership skills. We may find similar things to do, and we need to do that. And of course, today there's a lot of talk about developing entrepreneurship and skills and innovation skills and so on. But we have to understand that this is something that somebody from UNICEF explained to me, that look, entrepreneurship is not for everyone, and entrepreneurship is complex, especially, for example, in translational sciences. Dr. Raghuraman talked about medical institutions and medical research, and translating medical research into products and services needs huge ecosystem support. So we have to be aware of all these things when we talk about skill development. So here's a picture that shows you the profile of our labor force, of the Indian labor force in the age group of 15 to 59 who are employed. And we have 450 million, that is 45 crore labor force, and 34%, nearly 35% is self-employed people. And so we also have to provide, remember this, that the self-employed is a very large group, and we need to provide strengths to young people who are self-employed and who want to grow in their careers. And then, of course, there are the regular salaried workers and the casual labor and so on. And there is, of course, the self-employed unpaid family worker, which is mostly women, and who are caregivers, not just of their families, but of the elderly and so on. And you see here that the self-employed is only about 2%. I don't know how to compare this number. I don't know how, I mean, the entrepreneurs are only self-employed employers, which means entrepreneurs are 2%. I don't know whether this is a good number or bad number relative to international, but I found this diagram and I thought it was interesting for us to talk about it. So what's the challenge before our future generations? Obviously the jobless growth of economy, and it turns out that the economy was growing joblessly even during the 2000s, during Dr. Manmohan Singh's government, when the economy was growing at a very high pace. The jobs growth was not keeping pace with the economy, and that's because people are investing more into capital, into machines, and that can replace people. And this means that as automation picks up, there will be even fewer jobs. And this also means that if we teach students to do things that are automatable, then those students will lose their jobs sooner or later. So we have to be aware of the fact that it's the critical thinking, the problem solving abilities, the leadership abilities, the collaboration, cooperation abilities that will help students hold on to their jobs. And of course, there is growing inequality in society. We know that wealth is flowing from the poor to the rich. And this will create a deep impact on financial security of more and more young people. Post World War II, in developed countries, the successive generations were always richer than their parents. In the United States, this is probably the first generation of millennials, the 20-year-olds and the 30-year-olds, who will not be richer than their parents. And in India, we don't know which way we are going, but either way, there can be a lot of societal unrest when there is so much inequality. So we need to prepare our young people for that. We are educators and educationists. We need to think about how societies develop and prepare for it. And of course, there's something that is not talked about that much in academic circles, which is, for example, India's extreme vulnerability to climate change. There is a World Bank site which lists India's vulnerability, which can affect food security. It can cause migration and conflicts, which includes, and things we are seeing now. And we saw in Kerala how the floods devastated, how it caused landslides and so on. So unpredictable monsoons, droughts, and dropping groundwater levels, the melting of glaciers, which is causing fluctuations in rivers, major rivers that provide irrigation for crops, and so affecting food security. And groundwater levels, we have thermal power, and we have hydropower, and even energy security will get affected with water things. So I was very delighted to see that Amrita is actually very high ranking when it comes to the SDG 6 on water, actually. And of course, rising sea levels, which is threatening our coastal population. As a child, I remember my hometown, Kannur in Kerala, had a huge beaches. And today, when I visit, those beaches are completely gone. The water's risen so much in my lifetime, and it is going to rise more. It's going to rise faster, and it'll, cause migration. It'll need to migrate, and that will cause a lot of conflict. So, we really need to prepare our children for the future. So what do we want to do vis-a-vis strategic implementation from the higher education institution perspective? So the NEP 2020, to my mind, is an invitation to all educators and educationists to reimagine the future of education. You might call this a dream, but it is an important dream. It's important to change it. We have reached a place, we have hit bottom, and we need to go back, to start climbing upwards. And it is all the educators and educationists which will actually be able to do it. And the NEP has done its bit to actually provide the empowerment, so that educators and educationists can deliver. A dream without the tools and the empowerment would be worthless, but the NEP does provide the tools and the empowerment. So it puts the development, like Director Krishna Kumar mentioned in his opening remarks, that it puts the development of students as per their individual aspirations center stage. Then that automatically puts the spotlight on faculty, because who will understand the student? It's the faculty member who's in the class who will actually, or who interacts with the students, who will understand that. So we need to ask ourselves, how can we add value to students, develop their character, their human capacities and skills, including mental health, which is so important in today's times, because the life is moving on a faster track and is more stressful. And help them learn through community connect and develop an understanding of society. And like I mentioned also earlier, that academia needs to take its rightful place in society, in the economy, through taking initiative in doing relevant research work. And, Mata Amritamai, in her quote at New York, said completely correctly that, we have to evaluate people by how much you do to alleviate the lives of people. And in the shared use of technology solutions, I am aware of AView. I used to attend all the T4E conferences, and I think AView is a wonderful tool, and I'm sure that there are more tools that Amrita University is making available for the general community. And we need to anticipate the need for specifically trained workforce. So India is one of those rare countries where there are young people who don't have jobs, and there are industry who complain that they don't have the right trained people whom they can hire. So this is crazy, no? That you have people who have jobs, but they don't get matching skills for those jobs. So whose job is it to bridge the gap? Obviously, it is the job of the higher education institutions to understand the skill gaps in industry and to anticipate the need for specific, jobs that are needed in the market. So, so that's in terms of strategic implementation. And how do you ensure effectiveness of implementation? Like I said, the only way is to gather feedback continuously, extensively, and make changes as necessary, because many times policy has unintended consequences, and therefore you need to correct for them. And this is well known, but we don't ever close the loop. We only traverse in one direction. And of course, like I said in the morning, the pandemic has underlined the need and the opportunity to build back better. People are much more open to the idea of change, because change always causes a lot of resistance. But post the pandemic, I think there is going to be less resistance. And I was very happy to see Dr. Raghuraman bring up the Sustainable Development Goals, because it really gives us a template to think about what to teach and how to teach material that is of value to students, society, and the economy. And the amazing thing is that actually too many people are unaware of the SDGs, and even though India is most vulnerable, even though Prime Minister Modi signed the 2030 agenda for sustainable development in 2015, And even though goal 4, which is quality education, which says ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all, there are 7 targets and of this goal, and 4 of those targets have to do with vocational education. 4.3 says ensure equal access to affordable and quality TVET programs. 4.4 says substantially increase the number of youth and adults with relevant skills for employment, decent jobs and entrepreneurship. And then, the one on eliminating gender disparities in education and ensuring equal access to education, including to people with disabilities. And then, of course, 4.7, which says, to educate everyone for sustainable development. This is why integrating vocational education is absolutely, absolutely central in the NEP. And we need, and it's not easy, especially if, because vocational education is supposed to have a practical component which is very high. 60 to 70% of the time has to be spent on practical training. And many institutions don't have the resources to set up labs locally and so on. So apprenticeships where they go to the industry and learn on equipment, that high-tech equipment that's already there and not in their labs, are good opportunities, but it requires a lot of thinking and a lot of innovation to do it in a sustainable way year after year for batches of students. And that's where the challenge of strategic implementation will come. And like I said, the SDGs are very fertile material for good quality research that benefits society and the country. And I think Dr. Raghuraman already talked about several things. I put this here for a specific reason. I wanted to show you that Niti Aayog has actually already started measuring the performance of different states on various SDG parameters. Okay, so let's look at something very interesting here, which is SDG 5 and SDG 6. SDG 5 is about gender equality, and you see how uniformly bad the whole country is on the matter of gender equality. Female labor participation ratio is 26% only in India, 26 women to every 100 men. And there is a McKinsey report which says that you can, if you just increase female labor participation by 10%, go from 26 to 36, you will add $1 billion US dollars to the Indian GDP. That's how impactful gender equity can be. Similarly, you see the water, it seems like every state is doing well, it's completely green, but I find that very hard to understand because you see, 1 minute, where am I? Yeah, so you see, if you look at clean water and sanitation, I think I learned today that Amrita is doing very well in this, and this is wonderful. But we know that many parts of this country have huge shortage of drinking water. People have to walk, women have to walk for hours to go and get a few pots of drinking water. So how come, the Niti Aayog's index is showing all green? I don't know. And similarly, other reds are things like no hunger and no poverty, which we are in very, very bad shape. And this data is before the pandemic, so you can just imagine how these 4 core goals of no poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being, quality education, these are supplemented then by clean water, renewable energy, decent work and economic growth, industry, and reduced inequalities and so on. So I think that it's very, very exciting that Amrita is already working on the SDGs, and there is enormous amount of research possible, field work and research possible in these subjects. And I think that institutions must make themselves go-to places for know-how on how to achieve these SDGs and how to develop sustainably. So I think I want to stop here because I think in any gathering, it's always better to discuss than to have a monologue. So I never intended to talk for more than 35, 40 minutes. And I think I'm getting pretty close to that. So I'll stop here. There are some references here. The Vocational Education First is the report that I co-authored for UNESCO with Professor Neela Dabir of TIS. They have an incredibly sustainable model of vocational education, which enrolled 26,000 students in just 6 years, actually. And so we've used that as the basis, but we have actually explained in this report in great detail how educational institutions can leverage the NEP and the opportunities that exist in industry today to provide vocational education to lots of their students. The other two reports are the World Economic Forum report I mentioned, the UNICEF report that I mentioned, the climate change link for which set up by World Bank. It's as of 2013, but it still makes very interesting reading. And of course, the periodic labor force survey is very interesting to look at fine-grained data about women and so on and so on. And last but not least, I wanted to mention, and we've talked about this in the vocational education report, is that, and it was triggered off by this slide on Mahabharata that I saw Dr. Raghuraman show, that, preservation and promotion of Indian arts and culture can create many jobs. There are physical, tangible cultural heritage, like various sites which are managed by the Archaeological Society of India, and some which are not managed at all because Archaeological Society doesn't have the money. We need people who are trained and educated in the history of it, who can reconstruct those institutions in all its glory and so on. So that's to do with tangible cultural heritage. And similarly, intangible cultural heritage, all our arts and crafts and, the textiles and what do you call it, the sculptures and the carvings and all of that, they can lead to many jobs. And so if we can integrate that exposure to those in schools and colleges, it will make a huge difference. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much for the opportunity. I look forward to the discussion with people.
Thank you, ma'am. The session is now open for audience to ask questions.
Let's just have a discussion. I mean, I'm happy to hear about what people think about the NEP, because I worked for so many years. We started in 2017 in July, when Minister Prakash Javadekar called Dr. Kasturirangan, and then we kept going till now. So I can share lots of things about the policy if some of you are interested. So feel free to give me your comments and then ask questions that you like.
This is Raghu, if I may.
Yes, certainly.
Okay. Dr. Leena, wonderful presentation. A lot of thoroughness, and also shows that, as you said, several years. It's not just last couple of months. 2017 onwards, we could see it. Very beautiful. Several things that you mentioned. The way you articulated that was very helpful. I have one question on this UN SDGs, and you talked about how Niti Aayog is measuring at the state level. Now, for the higher educational institutions, how do you bring that level of accountability, awareness and accountability in them also? So today, if you look at this other generic rankings and all, they are looking at placements, they are looking at other parameters. That is still not instilling in them the urgency with which they need to look at whether it's a UN SDGs or green campus initiatives and all. So would government be better to do a thing like that? Or because very soon few private agencies are going to start ranking these universities based on these kinds of parameters, and then it will be all over the map and it will get diluted. It will have no effect. What would you suggest? Similar to way Niti Aayog is doing it for the states, could there be at the government level exclusively looking and measuring the societal impact of the universities. And it'll have some subjectiveness, but still we'll get started with something. Just wanted to see what would be your guidance.
Thank you very much for that question, Dr. Raghuraman. See, first of all, I think it's amazing that, I mean, we signed the SDGs and we signed the Education 2030 Education Agenda in 2015, and it has taken so long to percolate our commitment, our national commitment to our educational institutions, and that too only to some of the leading ones like Amrita and a few others I know. So that is telling us that, you know, we higher education institutions are at the fringe of the thinking of governments. They never sort of said that, you know, why don't you guys deliver to us the commitments that we have made nationally, internationally. So that's one thing. And the second thing is, very complex and related to what you asked, which is how do you sort of measure progress? I wouldn't even say rankings. I would say progress in achieving sustainable development goals or research in sustainable development goals by higher education institutions. And this is a very thorny subject, and there is some conversation about it now, but we need to have much more conversation about it, which is that, is it enough to go by, international and national rankings, which have a certain set of parameters which measure things that they can measure? International rankings try to go a bit beyond, sort of numbers, but still, is that enough? Can we come up with another ranking, or not ranking? Can we come up with another metric? And how comfortable are we with subjective decisions? You see, this is the big problem in education, that we have become slaves to numbers. So you want everybody to write the same exam, and then you want to compare their numbers to 0.5 or 0.1 to give somebody a seat and not somebody else a seat. We have lost our comfort with subjective, collaborative decision making, in which people discuss and argue and convince each other and go forward. But that's the only way that it will add value to the country. So we do need new metrics to measure, like Mata Amrita Mai said, that how is an institution serving, its locality, its community, people around them. How are they serving? Like you've done the landslide detection, that's a huge measure, and in my mind you would get huge amount of marks for that. But we don't have a nationally agreed on metric on which we will measure these things. Do we need to measure these things? I don't know. Maybe not, because it's our obsession with rankings is fairly recent, and maybe a decade, not more than that, for sure. So do we need to go down that path? If we go down that path, we need to remember the pitfalls of that path, and say that we cannot close options and say that only what matters for ranking we will do, because then we are in danger of becoming a fringe ourselves. And that's exactly where we are today. We are on the fringe, actually, and suddenly the pandemic has helped us, because suddenly everybody thought of vaccine, and so people are calling 2020 the year of science and so on. Everyone's woken up that somewhere underneath, the strength for science and technology, which was built over several decades since independence, is still there, but it's tottering. It's not enough. We need to grow it a lot. So I don't have a clear answer to your question, but we know that when we discussed it during all these committee meetings, that we need these, but like I said, we need leadership to figure out how we should do it as a community.
Ma'am, I'm Krishna Kumar. I have.
You're muted, sir. Dr. Raman, I think he's responding.
From the point of view of life skills framework.
Yeah.
The ICT literacy among the students, they will easily pick up
Yes.
because they would have been adapted to these changes right from the, day one onwards, they get to the changes. But the faculty adaptability, if it has to transfer across to this student-centric learning,
Right.
what we find is from the point of view of investment, the to adapt the ICT literacy onto a student-centric learning and the faculty adaptability. How do we uh, how do we find, it will be a great challenge. So especially from the present norms of learning and present norms of technology adaptation, will it be possible for all institutions across the country, or maybe few institutions, maybe institutions of eminence, with they know that they have to invest, they have to sustain through more investments. But how do you uh, pursue this challenge from your perspective?
So thank you, Dr. Krishna Kumar, for that question. I want to answer it by sharing two examples with you. So, when I spent 3 years at IIT Bombay as a researcher, and during that time, Professor Kavi Arya, some of you may know him because, I've seen Amrita teams at IIT Bombay many times. AVU was happening. That was much later, but even I have seen during 2000s when I was there. So he was running robotics labs, okay, for faculty. He ran a faculty program on robotics lab, and he found that faculty was very hesitant to touch or use the equipment and make something and build something. And this is afterwards he realized that he should have, we were talking about it, that he should have realized that this is true, because as adults we have lost the facility and the childlike, you give a child a mobile, in few minutes they'll figure out because they've touched and tried every option, but we don't do it like that. We want our heads to tell us which button to press. So that is because of our age. So you know what he did the next time? He had a joint program with students and faculty, and he made teams of students and faculty, and he gave each group a project to do. He brought robotic kits and they all had to make robots, and that worked very nicely, because you see, the young people are willing to use their hands and build something. The professors knew the principles, actually, so together they made a very good teams, and they actually produced very good sample robots, actually. So that was a huge learning, that we need to learn together with our students some of these new technologies. That was the message. And the same thing I wanted to say, that I happened to be in the US in 2013 or 14, I cannot remember. I was there both years, so I cannot remember which year this was. I visited the MIT because edX had started. Maybe it was 2013, and I talked to a few professors there about edX, okay? And they were saying, oh my God, this is, it's so terrible. I'm spending 40 hours for each 1 hour lecture. So I asked that professor, what are you doing with for 40 hours? It seemed like a disproportionate amount of time. He was animating all his slides. That is nothing, no static slides. Everything had to so that when students are sitting far away in front of their screen, there is some interactivity happening. So he said that for me to learn and make that happen was very, very hard. So they got also they also became clever. And what did they do? They took on teaching assistants, and these teaching assistants came with them. To each professor was assigned a minimum of 2 teaching assistants. But this famous professor Eric Lander, his course had 40 teaching assistants. Why? Because these teaching assistants were helping with recording, making recordings, animating the slides, running chat rooms, helping with homework, because Professor Eric Lander's course had thousands of students. So, you need to do homework. So I asked them, how do you motivate these students? Why do they come and work for you? Do you pay them? And he said, no, we don't pay them. We don't have the money. So we actually just give them a certificate saying that they worked with us in preparing the edX course, and that certificate was good enough for the students. So again, the same message was coming through, that faculty realized that students can play a very, very important role, and students were learning and faculty were learning. So I think that we are going to have to think through how we are going to help faculty get over a very natural hesitance that they have, and we have to be empathetic to their situation and help them get over it. And so there are no hard answers, but these are some of the directions that one could look at. Dr. Krishna Kumar, thank you.
Thank you, ma'am, for having shared your experience, the real life experience. You know,
Yeah.
it's a very, very good
madam.
experience you shared. Yeah.
Good afternoon, madam.
Good afternoon. Who's this?
Madam, I'm Vinayak Hegde from Amrita School of Arts and Science, Mysore.
Yes.
Madam, related to NEP, and nowadays the latest trend with the young parents, they are thinking like open schooling is one of the latest trend. Parents are thinking like child should not be get burdened. They should have a live practical experience. Like looking at the temples, they are thinking like at the age of 7, first standard, they should go to the temple, see the Indian culture, and we have to explain to them, not with PPTs and showing in the I think closed environment. Such kind of trend is coming up in the India.
Yeah.
Now, with the help of open schooling, now the open schooling and NEP 2020, how it is connected, and how it supports NEP, the potential influence of NEP 2020 with homeschooling in India. Like, what is your message to this, to the young parents?
Thank you for that question. This was explicitly discussed during the NEP, that, we had suggested, if you remember, the draft NEP had suggested that the right to education bill should be right to education should be extended from the present first standard to 8th standard to from age 3 till age 18. Okay, so but we had said there that it should be free and compulsory for state governments to provide that education, but it is not compulsory for parents to send their children to school if they choose to school them at home. Or in Bangalore is a place where many groups of parents are getting together and teaching students through agriculture, through visits to temples, all kinds of things. And they have the option then at some stage to come into mainstream schooling, maybe secondary school stage, and write the 10th standard and the 12th standard exams and so on. So this is good, actually. We do want a lot of experimentation, and the NEP has enabled that experimentation. It has also very clearly sent out the message that we have to stop burdening children. It is not the amount of knowledge that they have, because it's exactly like most people say, that whatever knowledge you have with the libraries, online libraries like Google, you have no benefit from that. You can be replaced quite easily. Whereas if you have creative abilities, then you cannot be replaced quite easily, because a robot will do what it's programmed to do. It will not think out of the box and create something new. So the emphasis on creativity and collaboration and innovation and all that is very, very high. So it's very clear that we have to reduce the burden of syllabus on children. We have to teach them how to learn. So you teach them a few things, but you teach it very well. You teach it very well so that the child never forgets it, is able to make use of it to do new things. If that happens, then any new thing that the child meets, he or she will be able to apply these principles to learn it himself. So this is the emphasis of the NEP, and open schooling, homeschooling, community schooling, all that is very, very actively encouraged. Yeah.
Yes, thank you, madam. Yes, thank you.
Dr. Raghuraman, you were trying to respond to what I had said in response to your question. I heard you speaking, but I couldn't hear you. I saw you speaking, but I couldn't hear you.
Okay. Now I had a related question. Let me see if I made my notes somewhere. 1 second. Yeah, you had actually made one point about that the preservation of culture, heritage,
Culture, arts and culture. Yeah.
arts and culture and heritage and all. Dr. Krishna Kumar, if you remember, a few weeks ago, I had discussed with you about this initiative on, animations and gaming and comics, and how government wants to set up many centers of excellence in this area. And Dr. Krishna Kumar has got some excellent labs, both UG programs and PG programs in this regard. And the first center is coming up in IIT Bombay. And then this is, of course, the traditional animation, VFX, all this is fine. But the point that Dr. Leena, you made, our own culture, our own heritage,
Yes.
whether it is Mahabharata, Ramayana, and there are many more like that. You take Bhagavatam and all. So I see that also another way where it is all technology and kids are very excited about it. Yet, our values, our samskaras, all of those things we can bring forward. And that is something, Dr. Krishna Kumar, we should very seriously consider. NEP explicitly talks about it. Your center, your school has got some excellent experience. Maybe
Yeah, we
Dr.
had
Leena
already discussed, and we were preparing a proposal for that. No, so
yes, sir.
that is in
And
the pipeline, still in the pipeline, I think. Right?
yes,
Yeah,
yes.
yeah.
And then
And
we
ma'am,
may take.
I am an alumni of IIT Mumbai.
I see.
Yes, yes.
Pleasure meeting you, sir.
Sir, we should pursue that, sir. I see again it sets apart from other institutions, and of course it's a stated objective in NEP also. So it will be a very good thing for us to pursue. And again, take guidance from Dr. Leena, and if she has more pointers towards this one, it'll be very good to pursue this one.
There is another thing which I may add, if I may suggest to you all, because you have multiple campuses in multiple states, is this issue of languages, preservation and promotion of Indian languages. We have lost 220 languages in the last 50 years. And even the languages that are part of the 8th schedule, the 22 languages, some of which are on our currency notes, we don't have enough people who can write in it. We don't have enough, and so we need translation and interpretation. We need manuscripts and stories translated into multiple languages. We need our approach to language at the moment in higher educational institutions is only at the level of communication for understanding the material. We don't explore literature enough. We don't give students very high quality writing skills. So about language, there is speaking, listening, reading, writing. So we ignore speaking and writing both. So there are people who have difficulty speaking fluently in a language, expressing their thoughts in a language, and that also has to do with all this mother tongue and this and that. But in the end, we are not equipping students with even 1 or 2 languages which they have mastery of. And this is also something that maybe Amrita and technology can help also, because
Absolutely.
Nowadays there are lots of tools to help you learn languages, but we need a translation and interpretation mission for all our manuscripts, and we need people to introduce new vocabulary for in every language for new things that we are talking about. What do you call them in each different languages? So, these kind of things.
Very good.
Yeah, somebody who had a question, Dr. Hari Krishnan.
Yeah. Myself, Hari Krishnan from the Department of Visual Media and Communication at Kochi campus. Amrita.
Yes.
Ma'am, NEP, as far as I understand, gives immense support for research.
Yes.
So, can you comment on the scope of research for those who will be selecting fine arts and media as their domain? And Do you have any suggestions on specific areas or topics on which they can go for higher research?
So I was struck by the fact that how much technological skills Amrita has, and how many sort of software for national use potentially you'll have, and the fact that you have strength in cybersecurity, for example. So and you have a very strong skill institution for visual media and communication. The scourge of our society today is all these deep fakes and all of that stuff. We need some people to actually train a lot of young people on how to detect these, so that our future communication with the people of this country is not completely derailed, because everybody's reading stuff, nobody really knows whether they're reading accurate stuff or not. So that's and some immediate area that strikes me. But what I wanted to say about research was that NRF is going to encourage research across the board, across all subjects, and particularly in multidisciplinary subjects. And they may actually come up with some strategic areas for India that is relevant, and that could include all this fake media and all the troubles with social media, and because that's really a big problem in our country today. There's a lot of brainwashing going on based on fake information and so on. But we may have some strategic projects like that. If you at Amrita think of some area that is worth looking at strategically, not just at Amrita, but across the country in partnership with institutions, you can prepare a proposal, and when NRF will come, you will be able to give it to them. You see, the message of the NEP is very clear. There's no more emphasis on top down thinking where somebody decides what everyone has to do. There has to be much more bottom up thinking of what is relevant and useful research. See, we keep searching. UGC, for example, says that you have to have 2 papers in Scopus index journals, and so on and so on, and everyone is searching for problems to do, and they're doing copycat stuff all around us. We have a lot of data gathering, data based, field based research, which will have no problems making it to journals at all, because it will be the first time. In fact, international researchers are coming to India to do research on how children study. So JPAL, Abhijit Banerjee has a huge JPAL project in India. Professor Karthik Muralidharan has a huge project in India, in many states in India, studying how children learn. Why can't we do this, actually? So if we look around at our societies and how societies are evolving, how they need to evolve, what they need to do, we will find very rich multidisciplinary projects to do research in. And then I think that would be my message, and that is the message of the NEP. Do research that is of relevance to your local communities and to society and to the country.
Thank you, ma'am.
Have I answered your question?
Yeah.
I think you're still thinking about it, but yeah, the answer is really that there will not be that much top-down statement. Although NRF could open some strategic areas of research. I believe that when NEP was reviewed by the Prime Minister, he said that there should be some strategic areas of research. For example, water might be one of them. Water management across the country might be one of them. So, and disease management and privacy of students, privacies of young people. See, we are quite old. My husband and I, we don't worry too much about whether Google gathers information from us or whatever. But if you're 20 and and something you did, a childish mistake that you made as young will come back to haunt you in your career. That's nonsense. So privacy is also some areas that sort of align very well with cybersecurity that Amrita already has. And I would say is really, these are automatic topics for research, I would say.
My question was, ma'am, specifically to the area of art, fine
Art.
arts, and visual arts.
So,
Thank you.
like I said, it is related to I would say it is related to the preservation and promotion of Indian arts, heritage, culture. You know, and because you have departments of fine arts and arts have a deep understanding of the historical basis and so on, you can actually spot the new opportunities that are there in our country to preserve and promote some of these before they die, and in the process generate jobs for lots of people, because there is today a huge market even internationally for fine arts from India, or even performing arts, or even sculpture and so on and so on. And so you could look at the perspective of promoting livelihoods through arts and culture. I would say that would be a of direct value to a lot of young people, and also of value to the country, because it will be preserving Indian knowledge traditions.
Thank you, ma'am.
Good morning, ma'am. I'm Kartika from SS Kochi. I would like to ask about what did NEP do to differentiate knowledge gaining and skill development. So our current education system is being criticized for knowledge gaining instead of skill development, especially in smaller classes. So what would NEP do to counter this?
Thank you, Kartika. So that was sort of my message of my talk, that we want to introduce children to, I don't want to, I mean, vocational education is the traditional name that is used. But, when we were children, I'm old enough that we used to do needlework, but we used to also go to on visits to factories. I have been to a glass blowing factory. I have been to a textile factory where they use waste, and I have watched how waste textiles come back and they are treated and they are converted into paper. For example, I've been to a paper factory. We are not doing that anymore with our children. But even at school, we could have kitchen gardens, we could do food processing, we can create jams and jellies, we can give them clay. Potters are very accessible, so we can bring potters to school, show them pottery, and then have those pottery baked, and then do paintings on those pottery. There are many things that children like. Why do you give clay or atta? When you make chapati, you give atta to the kids to play, because they love to feel that it is their perceptual learning, their sensory organs that are helping them learn. So we need to give more things in the hands of children to play, actually. And one of those ways is to also introduce, it will also help to introduce children to various professions. Like we were discussing during one of the meetings, that there is no reason why an X-ray film cannot be brought to class, and children can look at that X-ray film and talk about not just the fact that if you see the X-ray of your hand, all the bones that you see, but the technology that makes it possible. Or you can bring a blood report to class and talk about all the details of those blood reports. What does it mean to have a range for your cholesterol level, or what does it mean to have a range for your uric acid level? There is no reason why we should not be discussing this in class with middle school children. So that because you see, what that does is it encourages students to think about the application of knowledge, and then they start asking questions, and you have to be willing to answer that question if you know the answer. And it's okay if you don't know the answer, you say I don't know, and that let's look it up together. You look up and I'll look up, and we'll discuss tomorrow. That's the way to do it. We need to encourage people to not just develop knowledge, but develop the skills and the attitudes. That's why I said that if you want to be competent, then you need to have not just the knowledge, but you need to have the skills, and you need to have the right attitudes for a particular job. So if you are in a service job and you are an impatient person and you treat your clients with impatience, you will not be very successful at a service job, right? So each job has a competency associated with it, which is a bundle of knowledge, skills, and attitudes. and we need to inculcate all of that in the children. So there is a very nice foundation called Lend a Hand India Foundation. You can LAHI, Lend a Hand India Foundation. You can look them up on the web. What they are doing is that they are working with state governments to help school children, do a lot of things with their hands, and learn more skills like that, and do teamwork and learn skills like that. Whether it is a bit of cooking, some baking, you can think of so many things. And then there is some electronics. You open a desktop computer, you open it in a class, and then you completely take it apart and put it back again. At the end of it, you've seen the chip, the various motherboard, and you've seen the fan that keeps the computer cool. So you've learned so much just looking at it. And if at different levels of ability of the children, you can learn more and more when you open up a computer and show it to them and reassemble it and put it back on, for example, right? So electronics, computer hardware, there's just many areas where we can, or automotive, or carpentry, or fine arts, like painting and weaving, and all of that should be introduced in schools, because that then sort of connects what the children are learning to real life, and that's how they develop skills, actually. Have I answered your question?
Thank you, ma'am. Yes.
Thank you. Yeah.
Namaskar. Ma'am, first of all, I thank you for that wonderful session. And you are so articulate and so communicative that it is very impressive, ma'am. And I believe that teachers with such passion can bring about a change in our education system. And I wish that our interview system, both at school as well as higher education, I believe higher education can still be ignored, but school education is something where we need passionate teachers who can transform the society, ma'am. And perhaps our corruption should be checked there first. And another view, I am 72 born. So I remember during my school days, we had so many stories with morals.
Yes.
And moral lessons were discussed by the teachers as well as parents at home. And
Right.
but those days we never knew what a computer is or what a telephone is.
Is
Although
correct.
telephones were available, but we never knew all that. But
Right.
these days, the children know much more than us. And as you yourself said, if you give a cell phone to a child, he knows how to operate immediately, whereas we don't know. But do they still have those values which should stand them? I think that is what makes the difference between Abdul Kalam and Osama bin Laden, perhaps.
Yeah.
And so we at Amrita have Amrita value programs, but I don't know how far it is implemented in other universities, other schools. So this was just a small opinion, ma'am. Thank you very much for your presentation. Oh, sorry, I didn't introduce myself.
Yes, I was going to ask, actually.
I am Priya from the Department of English, Amrita Arts and Science, Kochi. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Priya. Thank you so much for giving me feedback and for expressing something which is of concern to all of us. I'm old enough to remember I studied in a convent school. We had Bible knowledge, and I had many Christian friends, and I used to go to church with them, and I used to learn. We had moral science classes. We had many things. It was not just my Bible knowledge was optional, but I took it and I found it so fascinating to read, because at some point in your time you have to pause and think about value system systems, how your action impacts others, and therefore there is a need to watch what you say, to think in a certain way. But along with that, Priya, I also think that, you know, the way adults teach values to children has to be by example. You know, we have to teach by example. And you know, some schools and colleges I have been to, they just terrorize the students. Adults terrorize students because we can. We have mandatory attendance. If they miss it, they cannot write their exams, they miss a year. What are we doing? What is the message we are giving that child? That tomorrow, if ever he or she reaches a position of power, they can terrorize the people who they have control over. You know, this is the kind of situation that actually worries me, that, you know, it's not enough to discuss values in class. It's important to practice them. And you know, I'm sure at Amrita you do that, because you have Mata Amritamani as your chancellor. But not all institutions are capable of this, you see. And this is why in society today you see so much friction. You see people unable to discuss without getting angry and being vengeful or revengeful or something. There are 7 billion, 8 billion people on this planet. We are not going to agree on everything. But if I'm sitting across from you, I can discuss, I can tell you my views, you can tell me my views, we will disagree, you try to convince me. If you succeed, great. If you don't succeed, it's okay. We agree to disagree, but we remain friends. But we don't have that culture. We are losing that culture. We still have it, because a lot of people still are very good with that. But we need to actively promote that in our classrooms. Discussion, debate with respect. You know, you understand that I have my freedom, but you have your freedom too. And you know, there's no such thing as absolute freedom of speech, because, you know, in our homes we know it. If father, mother, and children, you know, if there are rules, there are constraints, because families must function very well. Similarly, there are constraints because institutions must function in a certain way. But so we need to appreciate and understand these nuances. These are very fine differences which students need to understand. And no discussion is enough. And you know, just a value-based course is, while it's wonderful, needs to be supplemented with value-based discussion at every activity that we have, is what I think. That's my personal view. This, I'm not saying it from the NEP perspective. Thank you, Priya.
Okay, those who have raised hands may ask the questions.
Shri Gurubhyo Namaha, ma'am. I'm Ananda. I'm a professor at Class Coimbatore, Kumudguru College, and I'm also a PhD student at Amrita. Okay. So it's indeed an honor and a privilege to be a part of this conversation today with you. And some really interesting points have been raised by you, ma'am. But I have a question, ma'am. On a larger perspective, the NEP 2020 sort of envisions increasing the privatization of Indian education system, the higher education system. On a certain level, you know, when affiliated colleges are asked to be autonomous, the question of funding is raised, must be addressed for sure. So how is this envisaged? Will it on some level, will it make higher education lose its quality of equitable growth?
So thank you for that question, Ananda. This is a question that was debated and discussed, and, you know, again and again and again at so many different meetings. And, you know, if you see the list of the draft NEP 2019, there were some 300 groups that we met, and everyone came and talked about it. I want to say the following, that at the moment, higher education is mostly private. Okay, 78% of the institutions and 69% of the enrollment, as per Aish 2019 data. Okay, that is 2018 data, obviously, it came out in 2019. So the major responsibility for higher education being of poor quality is actually with private institutions. Okay? But we have private institutions and we have private institutions. There are private institutions like Amrita, and there are private institutions that are teach shops. They run B.Ed programs at ORF. Every week, one or two of our young people will get a call saying, do you want a B.Ed degree? It's available for 2 lakhs. Okay, so this is the situation, and therefore for NEP the challenge was that how do you keep the good private institutions and how do you weed out the bad private institutions? Okay,
Right.
this is never easy, actually. It's never easy. So what we are relying on, and this is again something that Dr. Kasturi Rangan expresses worry every day, what we are relying on is on the accreditation outcomes. Okay, we are saying that we must strengthen accreditation. NAC is 25 years old. It has developed enormous amount of experience in accreditation. Let's grow that and let's strengthen that process. And we demand that accreditation becomes mandatory, and if somebody doesn't fit the standards, then we say that you have 15 years, not 1 2 10. We said 10, but government has made it 15, but 15 years to strengthen yourself and improve your standards and clear this, meet the minimum bar. If you do, you stay, otherwise you shut down, because in the interest of the student, it's actually better to shut down. Okay. So, so what we are saying is that we need more institutions like Amrita, which have 20,000 enrollment. We want a minimum 3,000, 5,000, 10,000 enrollment. We have 65% of our colleges with under 500 enrollment. That is not a good environment for a student to meet a student of another discipline. I was a PhD student in Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore. In the mess, we used to meet people from metallurgy. Then they would tell us about how they are doing research on how bullets should not, when you hit your target, you should not mangle completely. So, how do you strengthen metal? So it's fascinating. You listen to metallurgists, you listen to power engineers, you listen to biologists, you listen to somebody who's doing peanut farming, agriculture-based PhD. So the expansion of your universe, the learning, that at least the exposure you get is very, very high, because then you are sensitive to those topics when you come out of your college, school or college. So that's why I said that we are not largely residential. So that is also a disadvantage. So we would like private sector to do well, because all private sector is not charging a lot, Let's discuss the funding for a minute, because this is very, very important. World over, what is the source of funding of educational institutions? Okay, so fees is definitely one of them. Government grants and so on, either for government grants by way of scholarships to students, by way of grants to institutions, by way of research funding. These are one of them. Faculty income through consultancy and executive teaching is another. Okay, and so there are only, in world over, there are only a few avenues, and industry money, because collaborative research from industry. These are the only sort of sources of funding for educational institutions. So traditionally in India, faculty being able to raise money through consulting and all those assignments or executive education has not been a very big thing. Okay, but for example, I wrote a report on College of Engineering Pune, where those professors were allowed to keep 75% of their income from consulting and executive education into for themselves, and give 25% for the institution. And even with that, it became a sizable income, because there was sufficient incentive for teachers to do these kind of things. Similarly, if you do industry based projects, then industry comes and sets up labs, and they pay for the students, and so on and so on. So what is happening in India is that people are relying only on fees. And therefore, the entire cost of running an institution becomes passed on to the students, and that makes it expensive. So in the NEP, we said that we will not constrain fees because only an education institution knows what its costs are, and we don't want to constrain fees and use that allow institutions to use that as an excuse to pay their teachers less. But we would request higher education institutions to have scholarships, partial or full scholarships for people who can't afford it. So if you look at the NEP carefully, it says there that 50% scholarships, partial or full scholarships, 20% full scholarships, and up to 50% partial scholarships for students who cannot afford it. And why should institutions do that? You'll say, oh, I will forget it, I don't want to give any scholarships. No, it's very important. Diversity in a classroom is also a method of educating students. If you have students from very well-off backgrounds and you have students from varying levels of backgrounds, they all talk to each other, they discuss their lifestyles, the rich ones learn to appreciate what they have and develop compassion for what others don't have, and vice versa. So diversity in classroom has always been used as a method of teaching kids, because they interact with each other and they learn from each other. So that is why higher education institutions must give scholarships to people. So that's been our approach. So we have got a lot of criticism saying that we have not curtailed private and so on. We did not want to curtail all private. We would like to curtail the bad private, and we are hoping to use accreditation to do that. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
Absolutely, ma'am. Thank you so much, ma'am, for a really articulate answer. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
Gasala Yasmin.
Yeah, thank you so much. A very good afternoon, madam. It was indeed a great pleasure to listening to your very erudite, dimensions into the new education policy. It opened up a lot of new avenues and even cleared a lot of confusions that were there. My question specifically is to the SDG 5 that you mentioned, which is the right to equality, which includes gender equality. Yeah. So, ma'am, I was just wondering, I'm sure it is covered, but I was just like you to enlighten me whether there is any specific stress upon inspiring girls. Because if you look at the statistics, in the Indian education scenario, girls are relatively not much of a participant when it comes to getting education in STEM. They would rather opt for liberal arts and the arts, which are quote unquote, not such skill set based discipline, and that's why they do not lead to employability. So, what has been, the emphasis of the new education policy to bring about a parity in terms of, aspiring girls in STEM? That is specifically my question. And just another small question, because I'm from the Department of Journalism and Mass Communication. Now, mass communication and journalism, as per the UGC, still falls into the traditional set of being a non-professional educational course. However, private universities mostly offer it as a skill-based course, which has a lot of employability prospects. So there is a kind of a dichotomy, when we are teaching mass communication, and that is what most of our institutional partners and industry partners complain about, that there is not much of a connection between what is taught theoretically in classrooms in journalism and mass communication, and how it kind of translates for them getting students, like prospective employees who are coming with a working knowledge. So, I mean, if you could just answer those questions. Thank you.
Yeah, so let me take the last question first, which is about next time somebody from company tells you that, tell them, give me 20 apprenticeships for my students for their summer. Okay. Or give me, if you have a class of 30 or 25 or whatever, give me one semester apprenticeships for them at your institution. Let them go to these institutions and spend time there watching people work and assisting them in whatever way they can. That is what I was talking about, the Tata Institute of Social Sciences, how they are teaching all these practical skill-based courses. What they are doing is that they're tying up with industry and telling the students, you spend 5 days a week in that, being an apprentice in that organization, whether it is Taj Hotels or whether it is Lupin Pharma or whether it is any, okay? And then on Saturdays, you come and we will do the theory part of the subjects that you are learning. If you're learning hospitality, or if you're learning pharma, or if you're learning dialysis technology or whatever, we will teach you general courses like financial literacy, digital literacy, English, language communication, but we'll also teach you the technical aspects of dialysis technology and so on. But that happens on weekends and evenings. But the 5 days they spend in the clinics and in the hospitals or in the hotels and so on. And usually in the first year, then this is a 3-year bachelor's course. In the first year, many students only cannot, for example, dialysis technology, they cannot touch patients, they cannot touch equipment because lives are in danger, right? You are treating patients. So they have to shadow. It's a legitimate work-based learning procedure called shadowing. They have to shadow existing people, watch them work, and get familiar with how they work, how they deal with the patients, how they deal with cranky patients or cranky relatives of patients, all kinds of things. They learn that. From second year onwards, they start doing little things and they get paid for it. The National Apprenticeship Promotion Scheme of Government of India says that industry can pay these people and claim deduction for their payment from their taxes. Okay. So students get paid also for the work they do. And can you imagine how much hands-on experience they have? So same way in media and journalism, they can shadow experienced researchers and help them with their work and learn and so on. And you don't have to do it for 3 full years. It's enough to do it for a semester. You get a sense, the kids will get a sense of how they do it, or they can do it for a summer. So that's why I said that, skill-based education is harder to provide because the practical component is so high. So you have to really figure out, work with industry and figure out how to give that practical component to your students, So there is another program at TIS where they are working with colleges that offer BA, BSc, BCom. And what they have done is every summer between first year and second year, between second year and third year, and at the end of third year, they arrange industry apprenticeships for 6 weeks at industry. And even that, if you do 3 times 6 weeks, you have gotten a lot of practical skills. So these are all methods that you can do to actually give practical hands-on training for students. Okay. And on your question on gender thing, there is data from MHRD talking about why women drop out. And both men and women, we have, by the time students reach 11th grade in school, 50% has dropped out, 46% has dropped out. So 1 in 2 students who start primary school don't complete 11th and 12th. Okay. So why do they drop out? So there is data from MHRD which says that a lot of them drop out for economic reasons. They need to help their families earn. Okay, that is not something that you cannot force that child to come back to school because their income is needed by the family. So unless you solve that financial problem, you will not be able to get that child back in school. And all these apprenticeship-based learning has the potential to do that because the National Apprenticeship Promotion Scheme encourages employers to pay apprentices. So these are things that we need to understand. And of course, in the case of girls, there are additional dropouts, but that's not a lot higher. I was quite surprised to see that only 14% or so drop out due to marriage. Okay, I'm just looking. I'm trying to see if I have the file here, to remember what the numbers are. So, and then some of them, women said that they can only work if they can get a job close to their home because they need to manage their homes and their families. So engaging in domestic activities for women is about 30%, 29.7. Financial constraints for women is 15% and marriage is 14%. So total 60% of girls drop out for reasons to do with gender. Okay. And for men, actually, it's more financial constraints and engaging in economic activities, 31%. drop out because they engage in economic activities, and 24% drop out because they have financial constraints. So that's again 55% of boys dropping out for economic reasons. So we have to understand these things, and that's why I said that, you know, as higher education institutions and as faculty members at higher education institutions, we need to understand the difficulties of families and then figure out how we can allow them to work during the day and study at night and things like that, which is why, for example, the NEP talks about creating a school complex which is completely heavily resourced, and keeping that school complex open in the evenings so that youth who have dropped out, women, and so on, can come and study there and work there in the nights, you know. So the Prime Minister was very excited by the idea of the school complex, to use a school complex as a community resource to educate, to give skill-based education to anybody in the community that needs them, you know. So the school complex is a very important idea, and it's very beautifully written about in the Kothari Commission report. I would encourage you to read the Kothari Commission report about the school complex, but also we've written about it in the draft NEP 2019. All right.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, we have two more people.
Yeah.
Vasan ma'am, can raise your question.
Yeah, ma'am, I am from Chennai,
Yes.
and I work in an institution which is partially aided.
Yeah.
And we have a combination of aided and unaided courses. Now,
Right.
NEP for a private to implement for a private university is very easy. Probably it will not be as difficult as it will be for an institution which has got both these streams, aided and unaided. How do you think the government will play a role in implementing NEP in these institutions? And how far would we be able to achieve our goal to set the syllabus and curriculum, the freedom to get, because we have TANSHE out here in Tamil Nadu, which says certain courses have to go by TANSHE. Now that may not be in alignment with what NEP actually professes. So how do you think we can bring in a balance and go forward?
So I have a question for you. I don't really understand what TANSHE means. What is that actually?
It is Tamil Nadu government regulation for common syllabus, ma'am, for higher education.
Right. So, you know, the governments must actually, state governments, see, education is a state subject. So state governments must also cooperate for the NEP to be implemented. So they will also have to dismantle some rules in order to allow colleges the autonomy to kind of teach the syllabus that they want to teach. Huh? But about private aided colleges, I have to say that in many places in the country, private aided colleges are only 13% in the country among all colleges, but they have 22% of the enrollment. And this is because the fact that they are aided means that the government is paying the salary of some teachers. So that lifts some pressure on the private managements to raise funds, and they can keep education affordable and so on and so on. So, and many of these private aideds are, you know, like St. Xavier's College in Bombay, or, you know, many missionary run institutions which are running very high quality education. So private aided is actually has turned out to be a winner in terms of the quality of education available to students. But as soon as government does not provide the salary of the teacher, and you have what is called these self-funded courses, then the disaster begins. Because, you know, for example, if you have a course in biology which has a lot of, or chemistry which has a lot of sorry, one sec. I'm sorry, I choked.
Never mind.
Which has a lot of consumables, then the course is unable to pay for itself from the fees. So, you know, these are difficult questions to have an answer. If private managements have to then look to raising philanthropic capital, look to raising money from, like I answered to, I think Karthika or Anandika, raise money through faculty consultancy, through industry grants, they'll have to look for other sources of funds. But government, although we have got the government to commit to increasing the investment in education by at least 50%, if not higher, we don't know where that money will go. But private managements do have the responsibility to find money from other sources. Like I said, financing of education is a very, very complex and difficult subject, and there are no easy answers to this one. But luckily, private aided colleges have good reputation, so they can actually increase. So you see, if the artificial barrier on enrolling students is removed, you can enroll more students and generate funding that way. Have I indicated your answer, Varsha? I'm not sure I've done that, but I'm saying that Tamil Nadu government will also have to relax rules, and private managements will also have to become more innovative with regard to raising funds. That's the answer to your question.
Okay. Okay. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Yeah.
Good afternoon, ma'am. This is Dr. Shamin. I'm a freelance academic and a filmmaker.
Yeah.
And my observation is that most of the research is happening in art and humanities in India is mainly the publication-based one, and the research framework available in here is limiting practitioners to come forward and do a practice-based research as such. So, is there any things that support practice-led research as per the national education policy?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I wanted to say that in the future, we should have largely only practice-based research, because theoretical research means that many educational institutions are repeating the work done elsewhere. So it neither gets you a paper, nor does it get you a patent or nothing, Whereas practice-based research can generate a good publication, it can generate good knowledge leading to actions in society. So the way that is going to be encouraged is that the National Research Foundation has the charge to fund high-quality research proposals from anywhere, provided they are high quality. So, there will be peer-reviewed, the proposals. And if the review goes through, then you will get all the money that you need to do the research. And you will not only get the money, if you need mentorship, if you need assistance with quantitative analysis of the data or connections to other fields of research that your own research has a bearing to, all that support will be provided through the National Research Foundation, which should be up and running by the middle of this year for sure.
So
shall we stop the
No, I mean, if there are only one or two more questions, I'm happy to take them, Dr. Krishna Kumar. I think, that's the whole idea, that we need to discuss about education policy. So I'm happy to stay if people have questions.
Namaste, madam.
Go ahead.
My name is Ganesh. I am from Mysore, Karnataka. My question is we teach the children the current education system and all those things, but nowhere we take their family, if they are from carpentering or pot making or goldsmith or farmer, we won't. I don't know. It won't be encouraged. It won't be encouraged in such a way that it's a value. It has got a value of its own, and it has to be respected, and it has to be taken in a generation.
Yeah.
Because we had done a survey throughout Karnataka regarding farming. Actually, we are running an NGO where we work with young farmers. The thing is, young farmers, they feel like it is not so, like any other professions. and they want to come to urbans for any other jobs like security person in a ATM or anything like that.
Right.
So, is there any place where we can make from the beginning, where they start their primary education system, that it has to be promoted in such a way that they can also learn that their traditional education, traditional practice which has been done by their parents, and also the current education system, so that it will be helpful for them in the higher way. If they won't get a job what they studied, at least they will sustain with their family tradition if they learn in a professional way. So in that way it will be useful, I feel like, because
This is correct, actually.
we are
Go ahead.
motivating the young farmers with the latest technology what can adopt, and we'll show those who are successful in farming, so that we are motivating them. You have to do the farming so that it will be beneficial for your comfortness and also for economical growth. So in that way we are motivating them. So is there any yeah, okay, ma'am.
So that's a very good question, and it's actually a topic that we have already touched upon in our discussions today. So the idea of providing vocational education to students means that, for example, a school in rural India, middle school, upper primary school in rural India, can draw upon all the professions that the parents are engaged in, So if there is a farmer, the students can visit that farm. They can maybe learn how to run a kitchen garden by talking to that farmer, or they can visit that farm regularly and see the whole stages of farming, which starts from preparing the land and sowing the seeds all the way to the harvest. Similarly, if there are potters, if there is a brick building industry in that village, then you do that. Or if there is some jute processing, for example, in Kerala, coconut shell and jute processing is a very big thing. So whatever economic activity is happening around the school, the NEP is saying that introduce the students to all that economic activity. You understand? So that means that if there is a child of a farmer and his whole class is attending, going to the farm and talking to his father or brothers and sisters and so on, naturally that will generate pride in farming in that child, but also in all the other children who go and visit. You understand? So
yes,
by by introducing community connect into the classroom, by going out, and in fact Prime Minister Modi is the first one. When the policy released in July, there were some early days when he was talking about the policy, and he talked about how if there is a railway station in your village, go to the train station at the time that a train comes in, and go walk along the train, go to the engine, see how it works, walk along see how the passengers are served. He was amazing. He was talking about really connecting students to every activity that is happening, and we are not doing that. We bring the children to the school and we lock them into some thing and pretend that actually we are giving them life skills, and we are not, right? So the NEP is actually changing that completely and saying that please make use of every economic activity that is available in the locality of the school. Okay.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.